July 9, 1968. Abyssinian Baptist Church, Harlem, New York City. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's casket sat beneath stained glass windows while 300 mourners filled every pew. Frank Lucas stood in the back, watching Italian mobsters from the Genovese family file in through the side entrance. They weren't there to pay respects. That's exactly why Lucas carried a leather briefcase containing $100,000 in cash and a loaded .45 caliber pistol. What happened in the next 17 minutes became the most talked-about moment in Harlem's criminal history. Witnesses saw Frank Lucas walk down that center aisle, while armed men positioned themselves at every exit. They saw him place that briefcase on Bumpy Johnson's casket. They saw what came out of it. And they saw something nobody thought possible. Italian mobsters, black numbers runners, corrupt NYPD detectives, and Harlem Street enforcers all standing together in complete silence. For 37 years afterward, when people talked about Frank Lucas, they always came back to this moment. Not the heroin empire, not the million-dollar fur coats, not even his eventual betrayal and cooperation with federal agents. They talked about what he did at Bumpy Johnson's funeral. The gesture that night made the five families reconsider their entire approach to Harlem. It made the NYPD realize they'd underestimated him. And it made every hustler, dealer, and soldier in New York understand exactly who controlled the streets now. This is the true story of loyalty, power, and the moment one man's respect for his mentor rewrote the rules of organized crime in America. But to understand what happened that night, we need to go back 15 years. Frank Lucas was a 23-year-old North Carolina transplant running errands for local pimps in Harlem. He'd killed a man back home, his cousin's murderer, and fled north with $47 and a straight razor. New York was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, he found himself cleaning tables at Wells' restaurant on Lenox Avenue, watching real power walk past him every single day. That's where he first saw Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't just another gangster. He was Harlem's protector, the man who'd fought Dutch Schultz in the 1930s, who'd done time in Alcatraz with the legends, who'd negotiated directly with Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky. When Bumpy walked down 145th Street, police officers nodded. When he sat down at Small's Paradise, the band played his favorite songs without being asked. He controlled the numbers racket, the policy banks, the protection networks. But more than that, he controlled respect. Frank Lucas studied him like a college course, watched how Bumpy never raised his voice but everyone listened, how he dressed sharp but not flashy, how he kept the Italians making money while maintaining black independence in Harlem's operations, how he took care of his people, paid legal fees, funded funerals, sent kids to college. One night in 1954, 3 men tried to rob Wells' restaurant while Frank was closing. They didn't know Bumpy Johnson was in the back room having dinner. Frank grabbed a meat cleaver and went at those robbers like his life was already over. Broke one man's arm, split another's skull. The third one ran. When Bumpy walked out and saw this skinny kid standing over 2 bleeding bodies, still holding that cleaver, he asked one question. "You always finish what you start." Frank became Bumpy's driver the next day, his bodyguard 3 months later, his most trusted lieutenant within 2 years. For 14 years, Frank Lucas learned the game from the absolute master. He learned which cops could be bought and which ones would set you up. He learned that the Italians controlled heroin distribution, but needed black dealers to move it in Harlem. He learned that real power wasn't about violence, it was about economics and relationships. And he learned Bumpy's most important lesson: never let anyone disrespect what's yours. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old and sick. Heart disease. Decades of prison food, street stress, and cigarettes. Everyone in the underworld knew his time was running out, and everyone was positioning themselves for what came next. The Genovese crime family saw an opportunity. For 40 years, they'd shared Harlem's drug profits with Bumpy Johnson under an uneasy truce. They supplied the heroin. He distributed it through his network. Everyone made money. But with Bumpy dying, they figured they could take full control, cut out the middleman, run Harlem directly through Italian crews. They were wrong about one thing. Frank Lucas wasn't a middleman. He was Bumpy's successor. June 27, 1968, 12 days before Bumpy's funeral, Frank Lucas got called to a meeting at Rao's restaurant in East Harlem, not his territory. That was the point. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, a Genovese capo, sat at a corner table with 3 enforcers. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a message. Fat Tony didn't waste time. Bumpy's finished. We appreciate his service, but things are changing. You're gonna work for us now. Same arrangement, but we set the prices. We control distribution. You collect and deliver. Frank Lucas sat there for 30 seconds without speaking. Every instinct screamed to pull his gun and empty it into Fat Tony's chest. But Bumpy had taught him patience, taught him to see the whole board before moving. "I'll think about it," Frank said. Fat Tony smiled. "Nothing to think about, Frank. This is how it's gonna be." Frank Lucas walked out of that restaurant knowing exactly what was coming. The Italians would move on Harlem the moment Bumpy died. They'd already started buying off his lieutenants, offering better deals, promising protection from federal heat. Some of Bumpy's own crew were taking meetings, hedging their bets. The loyalty Bumpy had built over 40 years was evaporating before his body was even cold. What Frank didn't realize was how fast it would happen. July 7th, 1968. 2 days before the funeral, Bumpy Johnson died at Wells' restaurant, the same place where he'd first met Frank Lucas 14 years earlier. Heart attack. Collapsed right there at his regular table. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. Within 6 hours, Frank got word that the Genovese family was planning something at the funeral. Not a hit, too public, too risky, but a show of force. A message that Harlem belonged to them now. They'd attend in numbers, make their presence known, and essentially claim Bumpy's territory at his own memorial service. Frank called an emergency meeting with Bumpy's top lieutenants. 14 men gathered in the basement of a barber shop on 116th Street. These were the soldiers who'd moved millions in heroin, who'd protected Bumpy's operations, who'd earned their positions through decades of loyalty. "We need to stand together," Frank told them. "Show the Italians that Bumpy's organization doesn't die with him." 3 of those 14 men wouldn't meet his eyes. They'd already taken Fat Tony's money. Now here's where it gets complicated. Frank Lucas had 2 major problems. First, he was 38 years old in a business where respect took decades to build. Bumpy had been a legend since before Frank was born. The old guard, numbers runners, policy bankers, veteran hustlers, they didn't automatically transfer their loyalty to Bumpy's driver. Second, Frank didn't have the Italian connections. Bumpy had spent 40 years building relationships with Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese. Frank was an outsider, a nobody from North Carolina who'd gotten lucky. The Italians knew this. That's why they moved so fast. July 8th, the day before the funeral, Matty the Horse Ianiello, a Genovese soldier, started visiting Harlem's policy banks. Not threatening, just talking. Friendly conversations about how things would work now. He made it clear. You could work with the Italians and get rich, or you could follow Frank Lucas and get buried. By midnight, 5 of Bumpy's major operations had agreed to switch allegiance. The drug houses on 145th Street, the Numbers Bank on 8th Avenue, the protection crew in Sugar Hill. They were going Italian. Frank Lucas sat in his apartment that night, a modest place on 123rd Street, nothing flashy, and did the math. He'd inherited Bumpy's organization on paper, but in reality, that organization was dissolving. He had maybe 48 hours to change the narrative before he became irrelevant. But here's what nobody knew. Frank Lucas had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. See, Bumpy Johnson had known he was dying. In 1965, after his first heart attack, he'd started teaching Frank something the Italians didn't understand: how to bypass them completely. For decades, the mob controlled heroin because they controlled importation. They had the ships, the European connections, the port authority contacts. But what if you could go directly to the source? Frank had made 3 trips to Southeast Asia between 1966 and 1968. Bumpy set up the initial connections. Frank built the relationships. He met with Corsican smugglers in Saigon, negotiated with Chinese chemists in Hong Kong, established contacts with South Vietnamese generals who controlled poppy fields. He learned he could buy pure heroin for $4,000 a kilogram and smuggle it into the United States in military coffins from Vietnam. At that price point, Frank could undercut the Italians by 50% and still triple his money. He could flood Harlem with cheaper, purer product and become the source instead of the distributor. But he needed capital, needed enough money to finance his first major shipment, needed $125,000. Bumpy had left him that money, in cash, hidden in 3 locations across Harlem. Frank had collected it the night Bumpy died. But cash wasn't his problem, respect was. July 9th, morning of the funeral, Frank got a call from Red Dillard, one of Bumpy's oldest friends. Red had been running numbers in Harlem since 1935. If anyone represented old-school legitimacy, it was him. "Frank, these Italians are gonna make a move at the funeral. I'm hearing they're bringing 20 guys, armed. They're gonna position themselves around the church like they own it. It's a power play." "I know," Frank said, "so what are you gonna do? Show them what real power looks like." Red Dillard didn't understand. He wouldn't until that afternoon. July 9th, 1968, 2:47 p.m. Abyssinian Baptist Church. The funeral was scheduled for 3 o'clock. Frank Lucas arrived 17 minutes early, which was late by his standards. He'd spent the morning making sure every detail was perfect. Not the funeral arrangements. Bumpy's wife had handled that. Frank was orchestrating something else entirely. He parked his black Cadillac on 138th Street and walked toward the church carrying a brown leather briefcase. Inside, $100,000 in cash, bundled in $50 bills. The other $25,000 from Bumpy's inheritance stayed locked in a safe deposit box. This $100,000 had a different purpose. Frank wore a black suit, black tie, white shirt. No jewelry, no flash. Bumpy had taught him, dress like you're already successful and people will believe it. When he reached the church steps, he saw them. Italian mobsters positioned at strategic points. 2 at the main entrance, 3 along the side door. More inside, no doubt. Maybe 15 in total. Not 20 like Red had said, but enough. They weren't even trying to be subtle. This was intimidation. Theater. Fat Tony Salerno stood near the front entrance, greeting mourners like he was hosting the event. The disrespect was intentional. Frank Lucas walked right past him without acknowledgement. That was calculated too. Inside, the church was packed. 300 people, maybe more, every pew filled. Politicians, hustlers, jazz musicians, neighbors, cops, criminals. Everyone who'd known Bumpy Johnson had shown up. The coffin sat at the front closed casket covered in white roses. Frank made his way down the center aisle. The crowd noticed him. Conversations stopped. People stepped aside. He walked with purpose, steady, unhurried. The Italian enforcers along the walls tensed. Hands moved toward jacket pockets. They thought something was about to pop off. Frank reached the front of the church, stood before Bumpy's casket, placed the briefcase on top of it right in the center and opened it. $100,000, visible to everyone, stacks of bills neatly arranged. The church went absolutely silent. Frank turned to face the crowd. His voice carried without shouting. Bumpy Johnson taught me that respect isn't given, it's shown. This money represents every dollar he invested in me, every lesson, every opportunity. I'm returning it to him because I don't need it anymore. Everything he taught me is worth more than cash, and everyone in this room needs to understand something. He paused. 300 people hung on his next words. Bumpy's organization doesn't end today, it evolves. Anyone who stood with him stands with me. Anyone who respected him respects me. And anyone who thinks they can walk into Harlem and take what my mentor built. Frank Lucas closed the briefcase, picked it up, walked directly to where Fat Tony Salerno stood near the side aisle, placed the briefcase at Fat Tony's feet, opened it again. This is what respect looks like. I give it to Bumpy because he earned it. You want Harlem. You're gonna have to earn it too. Fat Tony Salerno stared at that $100,000. Every eye in the church was on him. If he took the money, he'd look like he was bought. If he refused it, he'd look weak. If he made a move, he'd be starting a war in a church at a funeral with 300 witnesses. Frank Lucas had boxed him into a position where there was no good move. Fat Tony smiled, slowly. Then he did something nobody expected. He nodded. Bumpy raised you right, Fat Tony said quietly. We'll talk business later. Today's about respect. He closed the briefcase, pushed it back toward Frank with his foot. Frank picked it up, walked back to Bumpy's casket, opened it one final time, pulled out a single stack, $10,000, and placed it gently on the closed lid. For the burial expenses, he announced to the crowd. The rest goes to his family. Then he closed the briefcase and walked out of the church, $90,000 still inside. The funeral ended 40 minutes later. By 6 p.m. that evening, word had spread through every criminal network in New York. Frank Lucas wasn't just Bumpy's protege. He was a player. What Frank understood, and what the Italians learned too late, was that power in the streets isn't about muscle. It's about symbolism. That $100,000 represented everything. Loyalty to Bumpy, financial strength, fearlessness, and most importantly, respect for the code. By showing he had that kind of cash on hand, Frank demonstrated he didn't need the Italian supply chain. By offering it to Fat Tony, he turned a power move into an insult without throwing a single punch. And by leaving $10,000 on the casket, he showed Harlem that Bumpy's legacy was sacred. Within 3 days, 2 of the lieutenants who'd been talking to the Italians came back to Frank. They apologized, said they'd made a mistake. Frank took them back but gave them smaller territories. Loyalty had to be rewarded, but disloyalty had consequences. Within 3 weeks, Frank Lucas made his first direct heroin purchase from Southeast Asia. 100 kilograms, pure as snow. He cut it once, not the 4 or 5 times the Italians did, and branded it Blue Magic. It hit the streets at half the Italian price with twice the quality. Within 6 months, Frank Lucas was pulling in $1 million a day. He'd bypassed the mob completely, built an empire that made Bumpy's operation look small by comparison. But here's the thing about legends. They remember moments, not numbers. Nobody talks about how much money Frank Lucas made. They talk about that funeral, about the briefcase, about how he walked into a church full of armed mobsters and made them respect him without firing a shot. The five families eventually adapted. They let Frank run Harlem independently because trying to take it would have cost more than it was worth. The NYPD tried to catch him for years but couldn't penetrate his operation. He was too smart, too disciplined, too much like Bumpy. It took the DEA 12 years to finally bring Frank Lucas down. By then, he'd built a $70 million empire, operated in 7 states, and became the most successful black drug trafficker in American history. But on July 9, 1968, none of that existed yet. On that day, he was just a 38-year-old hustler standing in a church, holding a briefcase full of cash, teaching the mob a lesson his mentor had spent 40 years perfecting. In the streets, respect is the only currency that matters. Frank Lucas played the game better than almost anyone in history. He understood something fundamental. Power without respect is just violence, and violence without strategy is just suicide. If you want more untold stories of Harlem's underworld legends, the real bosses who controlled the streets before the crack era destroyed everything, subscribe and hit that notification bell. These are the stories Hollywood gets wrong. The real chess moves. The actual codes. Drop a comment. If you were in Frank's position that day, with 15 Italian mobsters in the church and your organization falling apart, what would you have done? Would you have played it like Frank, or would you have gone to war? This is the real story, not Hollywood, the legend.